Hello my lovelies and welcome back to my channel. Today is Sunday, so that means it's Slaughter Sunday with Sally. I'm obviously Sally, and what I do here is I research the ton out of true crime cases or mysteries or urban legends, and then I make a video and I post it for you. And hopefully we can have a discussion about it because I find true crime fascinating. So I just have a couple of service announcements before I jump in. One, I'm really sorry that I missed Sunday's video. I had an issue with my microphone. For some reason it didn't pick up my voice and it had a weird background noise, so there was no actual footage that I could use, which is really frustrating. But you know, being a YouTube content creator, these are the kind of things we have to deal with sometimes. So yeah, so I'm really sorry about that, but hopefully this video will make up for me missing that. Also, my second one is I would like to introduce you to my daughter's lovely artwork on my door. Apparently it's a picture of her playing in the snow, but no matter what I use, I can't get it clean. So it's just hanging around there right now, and I hope it's not distracting, but my daughter's 4. She's a monster sometimes. And she thought she was doing a lovely piece of artwork and she was expressing herself, but she used a Sharpie, which is permanent. So it's just going to be there throughout this video. So I'm sorry, but it is what it is. So today's case is a case that I hold in my heart, and it's one of the first ever cases that I learnt about when I was in my teens that really got me interested in true crime. And it's a really well-known case in Britain. It's a case that changed the way that we looked at the justice system and the way the justice system handles things like paedophiles or people that are on the sex offenders registers and having sex offenders in your area and not knowing that they're there. And this case was really pivotal in making movements in that subject and in that downright scary subject. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, then I'm talking about the case of Sarah Payne. Now, Sarah Payne was an 8-year-old little girl who went missing, and then she ended up being murdered by a man called Roy Whiting. Now, Roy Whiting was actually already on the child sex offenders register, as he had already attacked another 8-year-old girl a few years previous. But for some reason, he was able to kidnap, rape and murder this beautiful little girl, and her parents had no idea that there was a sex offender living in their area. And this is one of the main issues that came up from this, because if they'd had known, things certainly wouldn't have gone the way they went. And I will obviously explain that to you about what I mean. So we're just going to jump straight into this today. Obviously, the case today is about a child, so if you're sensitive to that kind of subject, then please feel free to click off my video, go and do something else, go and watch another video, enjoy the rest of your day. But as everybody knows on my channel, I'm not one of these people that skip the gory details, because I think in some instances it's important to know what happened to these people. And although she is a child and there isn't actually that much gory detail out there, I am still going to go into a little bit of detail about what happened to her. So if you're sensitive to that kind of subject, please feel free to just go and do something else. I really will not be offended. So I know that one of your main questions is going to be, how did a man who was already on the sex offenders register, who should have been monitored, manage to do this horrific thing to another child? Well, I think that's a really good question, and it's a question that I've asked myself. But to find out what happened to Sarah Payne and why, we have to obviously go back to the beginning. Roy Whiting was born in Horsham, which is in West Sussex, but the family actually moved when he was a lot younger, and they moved to a place called Chorley. He was born on the 26th of January 1959, and he had 5 siblings. Unfortunately and tragically, 3 of his siblings actually died in infancy, so it ended up just being him and his older sister and his younger brother. So there was actually only 3 of them, but he actually had 3 other siblings, and he obviously had to deal with tragedy very early in his life because of the deaths of his siblings. Also, it's very apparent that as he was growing up, his mother and father were the cold-hearted type. They would use punishment by hitting them with belts and slippers and wooden spoons, and they were just very cold towards their children. They didn't give them loves. I think Roy Whiting never ever heard "I love you" from his parents, and he just had a really, really tough upbringing. When he was a teenager, his parents actually ended up getting divorced. However, this didn't change the way that he was raised. He primarily obviously lived with his mother. She had full custody of him and his siblings, but he would still see his father. But they were still very cold towards their children, and it wasn't just Roy, they were cold towards all of their children. And I think that is really important for people to know, just because it makes you think of how Roy was raised, and he obviously had a really tough upbringing, and maybe that is one of the reasons that he did the things that he did. You always hear about these nature versus nurture kind of theories that go around, and I don't really know which one I believe. I need to do a lot more research before I can make a final decision on that. But I think it's really interesting that a lot of sex offenders and serial killers do actually have really tough upbringings. They are introduced to death at a very young age, and their parents are just not very nice. Roy Whiting was also described as a very quiet and shy kind of boy. He didn't have many friends, and when he went into his teenage years, he attended the local high school, and again, he was an outcast. He didn't have many friends. He wasn't very intelligent. He spent a lot of time just by himself, and that's sad. But he was seen as the weird kid on the estate because he would just do strange things. There isn't really an example that I could find online, but a lot of people did just say that he just did strange things and he was just a strange outcast kind of kid. In 1986, he actually married a woman called Linda Booker. Now, this relationship would not last very long. In fact, it was less than a year before they got divorced, and they got married and she got pregnant very, very, very quickly, and before the child was even born, the couple were divorced. So that just shows you how quickly that their marriage ended within 9 months. He didn't really have much to do with his son, who would later be born, and there's also a rumour that he also had another child by another woman, and this is a daughter, but this has never been confirmed, and I couldn't find anything online that would prove this. This little bit of information actually I found on Wikipedia, so it might not be true, but it could be true, so I thought I'd put it in the video. If anybody knows anything, just let me know. I want to know if that's true or not. I don't think it matters, but he may have 2 children, he may have 1. Anyway, him and Linda did get divorced. She raised the child, and I couldn't see much of Roy being in the child's life, but he ended up moving in with his father in Chorley. In 1995, Roy Whiting was actually arrested and charged for the kidnap and sexual assault of another 8-year-old girl. This 8-year-old girl is obviously unnamed, which is how it should be. And what happened on this day is she was walking down a country lane, which was very common back in those days before people say anything. In the 90s, it was very common for children to just go out all day and play. She was walking down this country lane and Roy Whiting came across her. He kidnapped her, bundled her into the back of his car, took her to a quiet location and sexually assaulted her. But then he dropped her off back on her street, and she did survive. And the reason that Roy Whiting was found guilty of this murder was because one of his friends, who knew him very well at this time, who he had worked with previously, knew the type of car that Roy Whiting drove, and he knew that he had a Bart Simpson sticker in the back of his car. And this little girl had described this car in much detail. In fact, she was a very, very fantastic survivor. She took in a lot of detail for an 8-year-old child, and she mentioned that this car had a Bart Simpson sticker in the back window, and this is what connected him to the crime. And then there was DNA found on his clothing, and his DNA was found on her. So he did end up going to court for this crime. The issue I have with this is that Roy Whiting was only sentenced to 4 years in prison, and we all know in the English justice system that if you're sentenced to 4 years, it's unlikely you're going to serve 4 years. And this is exactly what happened in this case. Roy Whiting served about 2.5 years of his sentence, and then he was up to be released. However, before his release, he was asked to go to a sex offenders support group who would be able to help him with his desires and his needs, and he refused to go. So they kept him in prison for another month, and during this time he had to have a psychological assessment to make sure that he was safe to go back into society. Now this is where the first mistake is made, and it's a really stupid mistake. So after his exam, the examiner would say to the judge that Roy Whiting was not safe to be in society, and he would do this again, and the next time the victim would probably die. Now we know in hindsight that this is very much correct, because this is exactly what happens, but at the time I don't know whether the judge took it seriously or not. I wasn't there, I couldn't say, but for whatever the reason, the judge decided that Roy Whiting would be safe to go back out into society. Upon his release, Roy Whiting knew that he wouldn't be accepted back in Chorley, where he was originally living, so he decided that he would move, and he moved to a place called Littlehampton, which is still in West Sussex, but it's more on the coastal line than it is actually in West Sussex, like right smack bang in the middle, and he decided to move here and make a fresh start. And this is where we end up catching up with Sarah Payne. Sarah Payne was born on the 13th of October 1991, and she was the third of 4 children to Sarah and Michael Payne. She had 2 older brothers called Lee and Luke, and a little sister called Charlotte. The family lived in Surrey, which is about an hour and 15 minutes away from Littlehampton, and they were a very close family. They were a very loud family. Having 4 children, Sarah would later say about how loud the house was all of the time, and you can understand that. The kids would argue, the kids would fight, the kids would play together, and it was just a very loud, unorganised home. And Sarah would also say that the children didn't really have a routine. They had their meal times and their bath and their bedtime, but other than that it was kind of free reign. So the kids would just basically do whatever they wanted. They would play, they would read, but ultimately they were all really good kids, and they were all happy. They were a big, happy family. Sarah is described as a gentle and kind little girl, the kind of girl that would do anything for anybody, and she had the sweetest little smile and laugh, and she had the biggest heart, and she was most certainly the princess of the family. She was very girly, she loved pink, she loved butterflies, just anything girly, Barbies, dollies. Whereas Charlotte was a little bit more of the tomboy, Sarah was just very much a girly girl, and she was very much the apple of her family's eye. She was just adorable, and the family clearly loved her very, very much. On Saturday, the 1st of July 2000, the family had made plans to go and visit Mike's parents down in Littlehampton to have a little weekend by the shore and just have some family time together. On this Saturday, Michael had just come back from his shift, and he decided to go and catch a little bit of sleep because he worked nights. So he'd gone back up to bed, and Sarah had to go to work because she worked at a local pub. She took the girls with her, which she did all the time at the weekends. The girls always came along. They would play in the beer garden, and they would just run around while Sarah got on with her chores. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah brought the girls back, and she says that it was a little bit of a rush to get ready. Everybody was super excited, and everybody was just all over the place, and Sarah, being the unorganised person, as she describes herself, had left the packing till last minute, which I can relate to. I always leave my packing till last minute, and I don't know why I do it, I just do. It's annoying, but we do it anyway. So she said there was a kind of a mad dash to get everybody together and to get everybody out of the door. Eventually, however, they did all bundle into the car, and they set off towards Littlehampton. And as I said before, they were in the car for about an hour and 15 minutes before they arrived. Once they arrived at Littlehampton, Mike's parents was waiting for them. Their names are Terry and Les. They had cooked them a nice dinner, and they all sat down and had something to eat and just caught up on life events. Sarah and Mike used to take the kids down there quite regularly. It used to be a very regular thing, but sometimes life takes over, and they actually hadn't been down for a while. So they were just catching up on life events and just having a laugh and having dinner. At about 7 p.m. that evening, Sarah, both her brothers, her little sister, her parents and her grandfather decided to go for a little walk, and they were going to walk down a country lane and cut through some fields and walk along the seafront, and then make their way sort of back round in a loop back to the home, just take in the evening sun and have a little bit of a play on the beach and just have a nice little walk. The family made it to the beach, and the children obviously started playing, and the parents were ready to like move on. And Lee and Luke asked if they could stay. Now, Sarah did this a lot with the boys because they were older. I think they were 13 and 11. So they stayed a lot and they were responsible enough to stay behind. However, on this occasion, Sarah and Charlotte also asked if they could stay, and they were begging their mother to let them stay, and Lee and Luke promised to look after the girls and they would head home if there was any kind of issues, because the grandparents' house was literally a 5 to 10 minute walk away. Sarah said she felt kind of comfortable with this. Obviously, she'd never left the girls before, so she was a bit on the fence to begin with. But she said the beach was empty, it was a lovely evening, and she couldn't see a reason really why the girls couldn't stay with their brothers, so she decided to let them stay. Now, this would be a decision that she would hugely regret in the future, and she's said this in every single interview that she's done, that this is one decision that she wishes she could take back. She said the last time she saw Sarah, she turned around to look at them and they were just frolicking in the sand and playing and laughing, and like I say, that is unfortunately the last time she sees her daughter. Sarah and Mike's father had walked down the country lane and they'd come to the local pub. They popped into the pub for a quarter of a pint, half a pint. They were literally gone no more than an hour from the home. They then headed back towards the home. By now it was about 8 p.m. and when Sarah came towards the house, she realised that her mother-in-law, Les, was stood outside and she looked frantic and she was holding on to Charlotte's hand really hard and she seemed really, really concerned. Sarah and Mike obviously approached her and asked what was going on, and she immediately asked them if Sarah was with them. It took a few seconds for Sarah to realise what was being said to her. She didn't quite understand and she was like, no, Sarah's not with me. Where is she? So she kind of got a little bit of information from the children. Now, Lee and Luke would tell her that Sarah had been in the field with them and they were playing hide and seek after the beach and they were on their way back to their grandma's house. But Sarah had fallen and hurt herself, so she said that she was going back and she was upset. Lee said he went to go with her. He turned back for a second to look at Charlotte and Luke. By the time he looked back towards Sarah, she was gone. Now, he assumed that she'd made her way back to the grandma's, so the children came back expecting her to be there and she wasn't. The adults in the situation didn't panic initially, and I can understand that. They thought that maybe she had hurt herself and she'd made her way back and she'd fallen and got trapped or she was stuck somewhere. So they didn't initially panic. They decided to just go out on their own. So they walked down the country lane, they were shouting her name and they couldn't see anything, and by the time they got to the end of the country lane, they knew Sarah wouldn't have gone any further. She was a responsible little girl. She was a friendly little girl. She's also scared of the dark, so they knew that she wouldn't have gone any further than the end of that country lane. So this is when Sarah started to panic a little bit more, and she went back to the home, and this is the moment that she decides to call the police.
Emergency, which service?
Please, I've lost my daughter.
Police, thank you.
So I call you through the police emergency. What's the problem? I've lost my 8-year-old daughter. She's been missing about an hour and 3/4 now.
The police arrived at the home almost within seconds. This was taken extremely seriously. She was an 8-year-old little girl who was missing. Again, the police were not initially panicking. They thought the same as Sarah, and they thought that she might have just gotten lost or she was injured and hurt somewhere. So they also joined in with a little bit of a search. It wasn't a massive search at this point, but they also joined in. The lead detective obviously sat down with the children and had a discussion with them. And this is when Lee would tell them that as he was going through the fence to try and find Sarah, he noticed a white van drive past and the driver of the van actually waved at him. Initially, Lee didn't think this was anything suspicious. He did mention it to his parents and said, do I need to tell the police about this? And they obviously encouraged him to do so. So the police took a description from Lee of this man, and his description was he was a scruffy, skinny man, unshaven, with yellow teeth and wearing a tartan shirt. This could describe a lot of people in the area, but they did a photo fit with him and used that in the future to try and identify Sarah's kidnapper. Also, the lead detective decided that he would take a look at the sex offenders register, and he wanted to question or interview everybody that was on that register from the area. Now, what's shocking about this is that in that area there was approximately 100 people on that sex offenders register that nobody knew about. Sarah didn't know, nobody knew that these people were living in their area. But anyway, the police decided that they would do this. They would knock on the homes of all these people and talk to them. On the 2nd of July, the day after Sarah disappeared, a massive search was now underway.
Throughout the day, local people have joined police officers to search the fields and woods around where Sarah Payne went missing. Sarah had been playing outside with her younger sister and 2 older brothers when they became separated.
There was approximately 100 officers, there was helicopters, there was dogs, there was family, there was friends, there was neighbours. There were people from all over the country that were just travelling to help find Sarah. She just became the nation's sweetheart within hours, and everybody wanted to help find her. Also at this time, the police were obviously knocking on the doors of the registered sex offenders. By sort of 8 o'clock that evening, they knocked on the door of a 41-year-old mechanic. And this mechanic would be Roy Whiting, who we obviously already know about, and he is in the area. He lived only 100 yards from where Sarah was taken, and he was a very suspicious character. He was very fidgety, he didn't really want to talk to the police, you could see he was nervous. But the police still asked them his whereabouts. Now, he gave them a story that he went out that evening and he travelled about 15 miles away to a fun fair, and then he came back and he was home all evening. But the police still found him very, very suspicious. So upon leaving his address, they called the lead detective and said, look, we think this guy knows something, he's really suspicious, what should we do next? But at that exact moment, they witnessed Roy Whiting leave his home address, walk around the corner and get into a van, a white van. And this white van was identical to the description that Lee had given him. And they also obviously pulled up on the fact that Roy Whiting himself looked like the e-fit that Lee had managed to create with an artist. So they already were pretty confident that Roy Whiting either had something to do with this or he knew something. Based on all this information, the police decided to bring Roy Whiting in for questioning, and they also seized his van. And they would do a preliminary search on his van to see if they could find anything about Sarah. At this point, they were hoping that Roy Whiting was actually just keeping her somewhere. So I can imagine when they got this van, they were initially like, maybe she's in this van, and obviously they would be massively disappointed when they realised she wasn't inside. But anyway, they questioned Roy Whiting, and because he's an infuriating and frustrating and downright ridiculous man, every question they asked him, he would reply with no comment, which I find really infuriating. Also, during the search of his van, they found a receipt. Now, this receipt was time-stamped for the exact moment that he told police was meant to be at this fun fair, which, by the way, was in Brighton. So they looked into this and they realised that this particular receipt was from a gas station that was approximately 16 miles in the opposite direction to where Whiting said he was at the time. So he's already been caught in his first lie, and the police are already suspicious anyway. But this just adds to their suspicion. Like, why would he lie and say he was in a place that he wasn't? On the 3rd of July, 2020, Sarah and Mike made their first public media appeal for the safe return of their daughter, and it's hard to watch. They were begging for either Sarah to come home or for the person who had taken her to bring her home. I think they knew that she'd been kidnapped by this point. I think they knew that, but Sarah herself certainly would not admit this out loud. She didn't want to think that her beautiful daughter had obviously been kidnapped, and I can understand that. I get that completely. The police ended up keeping Roy Whiting for about 3 days, or about 72 hours, and obviously they had nothing solid that could link him to the disappearance of Sarah Payne, so they were forced to release him. However, Roy Whiting was kept under very, very severe surveillance. They were not going to let this man out of their sight, because by this point, they would say that they were 101% certain that Roy Whiting had something to do with this. And this is at the point also where they started to think that maybe Sarah Payne wasn't alive anymore. But they hoped that if they kept an eye on Roy Whiting, he may either take them to where he's holding her, or he might take them to her body. So that's one reason they were keeping an eye on him. And the other one was because obviously he was a dangerous man and they didn't want this to happen to another child. So they obviously wanted to keep tabs on him so they knew where he was at all times to keep everybody else safe in and around the community. The search for Sarah, however, continued. By the 4th of July, the disappearance of Sarah had made national news all over the UK. And I actually remember this, I really remember this. In year 2000, I was about 11-ish. And I remember Sarah Payne going missing, and I remember it being a big thing. And I even remember my parents talking about it when it was on the news, like saying how they wished that Sarah would be found. And I honestly remember the press conferences by the mother. And at the age, you know, I didn't think anything about it. But now when I look back, it was just a tense and tragic time, and the whole of the nation were begging for Sarah to be returned home safely to her parents. The police at this point were receiving thousands of tips, and some of them were coming from all over the nation, people saying that they'd seen Sarah 200, 300 miles away, and these leads were followed up, but it was taking obviously quite a bit of time to follow all of these leads. But during this time, her family never lost hope that Sarah would be returned home, especially Sarah. Sarah made a bag for Sarah, like toothbrushes and clothes for when she was found, and she also was very firm in the fact that nobody was allowed to talk about Sarah being dead around her. For example, after one of the press conferences, a policeman made an under-the-cuff comment about Sarah probably not being alive anymore, but unfortunately Sarah heard him and she flew off the handle, and nobody was allowed to talk about that around her or in front of her or her children. It was just not acceptable to her. It was not the outcome that she wanted to plan for. It was not the outcome that she hoped would happen. So people were not allowed to talk about this, and I can understand that. I myself have obviously never had a child go missing for this extent of time. However, a few years ago when my son, who is now 11, was about 2 or 3, we lost him in a market, and you know, I can get where she's coming from into that sense. I mean, he was only gone for approximately 11 minutes, but those were the longest 11 minutes of my life. And that was just a mistake that was made by me and my ex-husband. We thought he'd gone with one, or thought he'd gone with the other. He hadn't, he'd just wandered off. But he was obviously found and he was safe. But if anybody had said to me that he'd been kidnapped or anything, I could imagine that I would have flown off the handle myself. So I can completely understand as a mother how she would feel about it and how she wouldn't want that being brought up, because that's not the outcome that she obviously wanted. The family continued to make desperate pleas for Sarah's safe return. They did multiple media interviews and appeals for their daughter. There is one that makes me cry every single time, and I'll see if I can play it for you, but if I can't, I'll just read what Sarah said to her daughter, because it really brings it home.
Sarah, if you're watching, Mummy loves you. And we miss you. And we're looking for you, darling, and we're going to find you. Okay? We're going to find you.
It's just really sad. It's really sad because now we know at this point Sarah was already dead, and it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. Following the arrest of Roy Whiting and his release, he actually left Littlehampton and moved back to Chorley to his father's. He was still the main suspect and he was still under full surveillance, but currently he hadn't shown them anything in relation to Sarah Payne, but they were still watching him. Obviously, it goes without saying that her family were very distraught at this point, especially Lee, because Lee had this responsibility. And okay, Lee being the older brother, which I fully understand, I'm an older sister, he had this, what he felt was responsibility to take care of his sister, and he felt like he'd failed. And it's really upsetting because even to this day, Lee can't forgive himself. He 100% feels like this is entirely his fault, and that's really unfair, because the person whose fault it is Roy Whiting. Lee couldn't have prevented it even if he wanted to, and I just find it really hard. I find it really hard that that family had to suffer the way they suffered, because of a monster. And if the police had been doing their job in the first place and keeping an eye on these people, this wouldn't have happened. But, you know, it gets me really upset. And if Lee ever manages to see this, which is unlikely, I just want him to know that nobody blames him. It's not his fault. And I hope one day he'll come to understand that and be able to move on with his life and realise that none of this is his fault. On Monday, the 17th of July 2000, the news came that nobody wanted to hear, and that was the fact that a little girl's body had been found in a field not far from where Sarah Payne had last been seen.
In a Sussex field tonight, police are examining the body of a little girl found just 10 miles from where Sarah Payne went missing at the beginning of the month.
Now, obviously, this was the body of Sarah, and we know this was the body of Sarah, but the family liaison officers that had been dealing with the Payne family from the beginning were the ones that had the horrible task of telling the family what happened. The family liaison officer, who is called Steve, arrived at the house where they were all staying at Mike's parents' home, and they took Sarah out into the garden, but Mike wasn't there at the time. I don't know where he was, it's none of my business, but they had to wait for him to come back. And in all honesty, Sarah said that she didn't want to hear the news that they were about to tell her because she could see on their face what they were about to say. But Mike did eventually come home, and they both sat down in the garden, and Steve very quickly told them that the body of a young child, a young little girl, had been found in a field by a farmer earlier that morning. And what really set it in for Sarah was that he said Sarah was the only child that was missing from the area. So they were 80-90% sure that this body would be Sarah's, and it wasn't in very good condition. But they obviously had to get the test results back and do DNA on this body, but I think everybody knew who it was. And what's even worse is that the children and the rest of the family had the BBC News on in the house at all times, just in case something came up and they hadn't heard. At the exact moment that Steve was telling her parents what they had found, the news also came up on the TV. So the children saw it at exactly the same time the parents were being told. And Sarah would later say in an interview that one thing she remembers the most is that her children came running out of the patio door, followed by other members of the family, and they were just screaming at her, you know, is it true? Is it true? Is it Sarah? And at that moment, Sarah couldn't give them an answer because she wasn't sure, but I think everybody knew that the body was that of Sarah Payne. Later that afternoon, the body was confirmed through DNA that it was, of course, the body of Sarah. Now, Steve, the family liaison officer, told Sarah and Mike that it was her body. And Sarah said that she was desperate to see her daughter, she wanted to see her, and Steve did not think this was a good idea. He said that her remains had been left out in the weather for 17 days, and she just wasn't in good condition. The wildlife had got to her, the weather had got to her, it was hot, so she had decomposed very quickly. But Sarah was still adamant that she wanted to go. So Steve made a deal with her. He said that he would go first, and he would come back and describe what he saw to Sarah, and then if she still wanted to go, he would happily take her. So she agreed to this, and after a few hours, Steve did return. And when he returned, she said he looked like the shadow of the man that he was before he left. And at that moment, she decided that she couldn't see Sarah, and that Sarah wouldn't want her to see her like that, because she was a girly girl, she was a princess, and she wouldn't want her mother to see her decomposing body. So she decided she definitely wasn't going to go in that moment, but Steve would later say that he will never get that image burned out of his memory, and sometimes he sees it before he goes to sleep, and it's the first thing he sees when he wakes up, and he is very thankful for the fact that Sarah or Mike didn't go and see their daughter like that, because that's not the last image that he wanted them to have of their beautiful, sweet, darling little 8-year-old daughter. This now obviously became a murder inquiry, and the police upped their game. They knew now that Sarah was dead, and they, like I said before, were 101% certain that Roy Whiting had done this to her, but they just needed the proof and they were struggling to get it. But then maybe God heard their call, their stars aligned, something, because not a few days after Sarah's body was found, a woman called Deborah Bray made a call that would change everything. She called the tip line and she told them that just after Sarah had vanished, she had seen a child's black shoe in the middle of the road. Now, she didn't know if this had anything to do with Sarah, but she did say that she remembered this because it looked like a new shoe, so it hadn't been there that long. And she also said that she remembered because she thought maybe a child had thrown it out the window and the mother would have been pissed. The police asked her if she would mind going to see if she could find the shoe and get it for them so they could test it for DNA. Deborah agreed to this, and she travelled to the area that was not actually that far from where Sarah's body would be found, actually. So anyway, she went to the location and she parked up her car and she walked up and down this country lane, and just as it was getting to the point that she was going to give up because she couldn't find it anywhere, she saw something black sticking out from underneath one of the hedges. And the shoe was now not in the best of condition, but it was clearly the same shoe that she had seen. So she picked it up very, very gingerly and took it straight to the police department, where they sent it off for testing. Now, with the testing, it was difficult because the West Sussex Police aren't a massive police force. They're quite small compared to like the Lincolnshire Police or the Nottinghamshire Police. They're quite a small unit, and they had over 500 items of things that needed testing that they'd found on Sarah's remains or in Roy Whiting's car, or just things that they genuinely needed testing for this case. And the forensic scientist lab only had about 2 or 3 forensic scientists, and it can take days to test one item. So they were really, really struggling to get the DNA done really, really quickly. So they knew that this was going to take a while, and they were concerned that Roy Whiting would be out on the loose and do something else. Even though they had him under constant surveillance, it was obviously still a concern. But again, like in the DNA with the shoe kind of circumstance, something happened. The stars must have aligned again, or God heard their prayers, or something, because Roy Whiting made a stupid mistake that would take him off the streets. But I will come back to that in just a second. After her body was found, Sarah, Michael, Lee, Luke and Charlotte and the grandparents all visited the site of where Sarah's body was found. People were leaving flowers and cards and that kind of thing, and it was all filmed for the media, which was obviously really, really difficult. But also at this point, Sarah began to look into research in terms of sex offenders and the rights that they have after being released from prison, and she was absolutely disgusted by what she saw. She saw that there were hundreds of sex offenders all over the UK who had either got new identities or people just didn't know they were sex offenders because they were living elsewhere. And she thought that this was completely disgusting, and she knew that if she knew Roy Whiting was a sex offender, she wouldn't have let her daughter stay. And she didn't want this happening to any other child. Luckily at this time, a newspaper called the News of the World, which used to be a Sunday newspaper in the UK, which now we don't have, they started a petition in this newspaper which was to find out if people of the British public would like to know if there was a sex offender living in their area. And they brought Sarah in on this campaign, and she did some news reports and such like, and she went onto the TV and things, and she was encouraging people to want to know this information. And they did, because 90% of the slips that they received back from the newspaper were, yes, we think we have the right to know this information. So, what did the News of the World do? Well, they took 50 names from the Sex Offenders Register and printed them in their newspaper. And it wasn't just their names, some of it was their addresses and the offences that they had committed. Now, this was massively controversial in this time because it did lead to some attacks, and some attacks that were unfounded. There was one story that I heard about a paediatrician who shared a similar name to a sex offender, and the people in the area had got that mixed up, and they thought this paediatrician was actually a child rapist. So they'd smashed his windows and tried to set his house on fire. And it turned out he was a completely innocent person, but he had to move away from the area, and his job was under criticism as well. So his life was massively affected, and he wasn't even on the register. So it became an issue, but Sarah still says to this day that she's glad it was done, because these people had the right to know that there were actual sex offenders in the area. But she was sorry that innocent people had been attacked, of course. But obviously, people in the UK, people within our society, were angry. They were angry that Roy Whiting had been able to do this, and they were angry because they seemed to have been protecting him. Like, the justice system would protect sex offenders, and it didn't make sense to people. Sarah worked extremely hard to try and make changes to our child sex offender laws and legislations. She would set up meetings, she would do research that she didn't necessarily want to do, and she didn't want to know how the mind of a sex offender worked, but she knew to make this work, she had to do that. She had to find out why, what, when, how. She had to find out all this information. And it actually worked. There were changes made to the law that actually helped. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, before the new legislation came in, sex offenders could be released from prison, and then they would have 4 weeks to register on the sex offenders register and meet a probation officer. 4 weeks in which they could have done anything, and nobody knew where they were at this time. 4 weeks. I'm going to say it again. 4 weeks. And also, to top it off, they wouldn't have to show up in person. No. They could just call up the probation or call up the sex offenders register place and do information over the phone. How is that protecting our children, UK government? What an absolute joke. And this is the year 2000 as well, so it's not like we're talking about the 70s and the 60s, where these things were less common knowledge, for example. They weren't less common, they were just less common knowledge. We didn't have the massive media that we had, the 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week media that we had. And even in 2000, we had a lot more media. So I just can't fathom the fact that this was still part of their law in 2000. I don't understand, and I don't need to understand, because this was now changed. Thanks to Sarah, sex offenders would have to register within 72 hours of their release from prison, and they would have to do it in person. They could no longer do it over the phone, because if they were over the phone, they could be anywhere in the world, and they could ring up and say, yeah, by the way, I'm living here, and they just have to take the word for it. Whereas now, they physically have to show up. Also now, probation officers and the sex offenders register are legally allowed, if they want to take pictures and fingerprints and DNA from a child sex offender when they have to go to the registry. Now, they didn't have to do this before, and they don't have to do it now, but they can. There is no legal implications stopping them from taking this information if they want to. Whether they do, I don't know. I don't know whether they do or whether they don't. I like to think that they do, because it could solve crimes, obviously. But again, they don't have to do it, but they can now. Now we're going to go back to Roy Whiting and why the police's prayers were answered. Well, Roy Whiting, being the moron that he is, on the 23rd of July 2000 decided that he would steal himself a car and make a run for it, because he's a moron. Obviously, he was being surveilled or surveillanced at this time, and the police saw him do this, and they chased him through the streets of Chorley, and he ended up crashing the car and abandoning it, but he was chased on foot and eventually caught, and he was obviously arrested for grand theft auto. Fucking idiot. But this obviously made the family and the police very happy, because now he would be sent to prison on grand theft auto charges, and he was to serve, I think it was 12 months, so they had a year nearly to find DNA to match Sarah to him, to get him for first degree murder. And they didn't take their time with this. Obviously, they were trying to rush this through, but they were happy in the knowledge that he was now sat in prison, so he couldn't hurt anybody else. And finally, they got a break in their forensics, and obviously that break came from that little black shoe that was found by Deborah Bray. The shoe had Velcro, and Velcro is very good at collecting fibres and anything really. It can be a pain in the arse, if I'm honest, but in this instance, it was the best thing they had, because they managed to pull off fibres from her shoe, little red fibres, that matched identically to a jumper of Roy Whiting's that was found in his van, which proved that he had to have been in contact with Sarah at some point before she died. And he had always said that he didn't know who Sarah was and he'd never met her before, so they got him. But there was also extra evidence that they found. On this jumper, a total of 14 hairs were found. Now, 39 of these hairs didn't match Sarah at all. Then there was a one single hair that was about this big that they managed to connect to Sarah Payne. Her hair was also found on his jumper. One lonely strand. On the 31st of August 2000, before they made a match with the forensics, however, Sarah Payne's funeral was held in her hometown of Surrey, and it was attended by her primary school teachers, her friends, obviously her family. And Sarah would later say that this was an important moment, not just for her and her family, but for everybody, because everybody wanted to lay this girl to rest. Sarah had become the nation's child, not just Sarah and Mike's child. She had given away so much of her daughter and her daughter's life and her daughter's personality to be able to find her, that she thought that having a funeral or a memorial service would let her get a bit of her daughter back, and the nation could say goodbye to Sarah, and then the family could go on and mourn. And this is what they did. On the 6th of February 2001, Roy Whiting's funeral began, and his defence, absolutely shit. They just said that he didn't do it and there wasn't really anything else they could say. Ridiculous. But Sarah's family obviously attended, and Sarah would later say again that when she was sat in the court, Roy Whiting was obviously brought up from his cell, and she said she looked at him and didn't see a monster, which she expected to see, which we all expect to see. We all expect murderers, serial killers, child rapists to be a monster, to be something we've created in our mind, and Roy Whiting was just a scrawny, disgusting, dirty, short, skinny, vile thing. And Sarah finally was like, yeah, I'm not afraid of him, you know, he's scum, he's a piece of shit, and I'm not afraid of him. Because I think she'd built up in her head that he was this monster and that she was afraid of him, and she thought everybody should be afraid of him. But he wasn't that monster, he was just a disgusting man. On the 13th of November 2001, the jury was sent out to deliberate, and it took them 3 days to come back with a verdict. I don't know why, but they did keep asking to see pictures of Sarah and to see pictures of her family. So I think they were struggling with it, and they obviously had to see the pictures of her body, and it was just absolutely awful. The jury came back to give their verdict, and they gave a verdict of guilty on unlawful kidnap and first-degree murder of Sarah Payne. They were a visibly shaken bunch of people. The foreman of the jury actually cried when they were talking about the verdict, and many of the jury members were trying to hide their tears from the Payne family, and they were clearly distraught. And what's even more frustrating is that the jury members probably didn't get any kind of counselling for this, and that's also really sad. They had to see things that nobody should have to see, and they later would talk about the fact that they couldn't find him not guilty. It was obvious that he'd done it. They just needed time, and they were taking moments of silence for Sarah, which is why it took them so long to come back. But ultimately, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But ultimately, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Now, the judge would say that Roy Whiting should never ever be released. He would be one of these people that spent a whole life term, whatever it's called, in prison, because he was a danger to every child in society. And I think the judge is correct. If this man is released, he would just do it again. He would just go after the most innocent people within our society, and that's our children. And he cannot be released. And if he's ever released, I think we should all go into hiding, because he will do this again. Up to this point, the jury and the court were not allowed to hear about Whiting's previous criminal offences and the sexual assault that he'd done on that other 8-year-old little girl. And when Sarah heard this, she was even more angry, because initially she didn't know that Whiting had committed any other crimes, and at this point, boy was she mad. She was mad. And she made a speech outside of court, which again I'll try and play, but if I can't I will read it for you.
The judge said he'd be recommending that Whiting be kept in prison for the rest of his life. This was met by the loudest cries of yes in court. Whiting was taken away to begin that sentence tonight.
This doesn't make us happy, but justice has been done. Sarah can rest in peace now. But let's make sure that this stops happening time and time again.
And I think that's really important, and I think that's a really big moment, because she is 100% correct. These people knew that Roy Whiting would do this again and he would potentially kill next time, and that's exactly what happened. And Sarah and Sarah and Mike and Lee and Luke and Charlotte and every other child and person in Britain were let down by the justice system. And this isn't the first time, and it won't be the last. So I beg to question what needs to be done and what can we do to help, because I think the statistics speak for themselves. I just think it's disgusting. Sarah, however, did not die in vain, as her mother would not allow to happen. A few years after Roy Whiting's conviction, Sarah set up something called Sarah's Law. Now, people in America will know that they have a Megan's Law over there, and Sarah's Law is basically the same. And it means that people can make applications to the local police to find out information about people they're concerned about, to see if they're on the sex offenders register. And this was rolled out in 4 counties in the UK in 2008, and it was a huge success, a massive success. There were 600 inquiries made, 315 applications were then made from those inquiries, and 43 of those applications would identify confidential information that that person was on the sex offenders register, so these families could keep their children safe. That doesn't seem like a lot compared to the amount of inquiries that were made, but that is a lot of sex offenders that people didn't know about. 43 people in just those 4 counties, and just the applications that were made were on the sex offenders register, and people didn't know. And that's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. Anyway, it was such a massive success that it was rolled out in our entire country, and even to today it is still a success. I have never used it myself. I've never felt like I needed to, but I am comfortable in the knowledge that it's there, and if I need to use it, I certainly would use it, but I hope I never have to, because I don't want to be around people that could potentially be a risk to my children. But like I said, it's nice to know that it's there in case I need to use it. The aftermath of Sarah's death was traumatic, to say the least. Sarah and Mike both grieved, but they grieved in completely different ways, which would ultimately lead to them getting a divorce in 2003. Sarah would fight. She, like I've already said, she was dealing with Sarah's Law, and she was fighting for legislation for children. She was fighting for children's safety, and she put her heart and soul into that. She wrote a book, she did interviews. She really, really fought hard. And Mike, on the other hand, really struggled with the death of his daughter, his princess, his daddy's little girl. He hit the drink really hard, and he unfortunately became an alcoholic, and he ended up serving time in prison for fighting with his brother. And he never grieved, and he never moved on properly from what had happened. And I'm not saying, obviously, people need to move on after their child dies. That's absolutely ridiculous. But Sarah found a way of coping with this as well as grieving, whereas Mike couldn't seem to do that. He couldn't cope. He just couldn't do it, and that no one can judge him for that. Unless you've lost a child, you don't know how it feels, and I can't imagine how it feels, and I don't want to imagine how it feels. But he did really, really struggle. So much so that in 2014, he was actually found dead in his house. There has never been a statement that would tell us how he died, but a lot of people have obviously put it down to his alcohol consumption, liver failure, things of that nature, and they were probably right, but I don't want to speculate and I don't want to guess, so I don't know how he died, but I do think that it was really tragic, and it was just another blow for the Payne family, and his 3 remaining children really struggled with the death of their father. It was just a mess. But recently the children have done an interview, I can't remember what it was on, this morning or something, and they seem to be coping well. They've all grown up. They have moved on with their life while still remembering Sarah and their father and thinking of them fondly. But Sarah will always be stuck as an 8-year-old child. She obviously never grew. She was frozen in time as an 8-year-old little girl, and that's how they always have to remember her. And that's sad. But that's it. That's the video that I wanted to do today. That's the case of Sarah Payne. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learnt a lot. My thoughts always go out to the family after they've been through something so tragic. Sarah will never ever be forgotten. She is one name and face that I always remember, and every time I think of true crime, I think of Sarah Payne and her tragic early death, and the fact that Roy Whiting was able to do this. And it's shocking, but I commend Sarah for the way she's dealt with this and the way that she's tried to protect other people's children. And I'm thankful for that, because I have children of my own, and she has protected them, and she has put in legislation and changed laws to help children like mine, and I am eternally grateful for that. But I'm going to leave that there today, guys. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell notification so you know every time I post a video. Normally it's Sundays, and then I do a midweek mystery on a Wednesday, unless something happens, like my microphone stops working. But yes, that's it. And also, if you see my videos over on my other social medias, please like, comment and share. I'm really struggling to find people to do that at the moment, and I don't want to keep begging them. So if you do happen to see it, please feel free to like, comment and share. And also, I have a Facebook page which is called Passion of Crime. You can go over there, give that a bit of a like. I update that every day with different crimes, and old, new, whatever I just fancy. And you can also message me on there with case requests. I also have a case request form that you can fill in, and I will look into them cases for you, whether you're a family member or not. So thank you, guys. Thank you for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you, and I hope you stay safe, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. I love you guys. Bye.
Jet planes in the night sky with you, getting high in the sunrise with you, getting through all the bad times with you. I wasn't missing a thing, no I do. And I wish that I could build a time machine, 'cause time moves on, and now you're gone. Oh, if only I could build a time machine, I'd come and get you. I can't forget you.